June 4, 1942. The vast Pacific Ocean stretches endlessly beneath a clear morning sky. Two naval armadas are converging on a tiny speck of coral reef called Midway Atoll, 1,300 miles northwest of Hawaii. In the next few hours, the course of World War II will be decided in what historians will call the most stunning and decisive blow in the history of naval warfare. This is the story of the Battle of Midway, where American codebreakers, dive bomber pilots, and sheer luck combined to deal Imperial Japan a blow from which it would never recover. To understand Midway, we must first go back 6 months. 2. December 7, 1941. The Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor had been devastatingly successful. 8 battleships damaged or destroyed. Nearly 200 aircraft obliterated. Over 2,400 Americans dead. The Pacific Fleet was crippled, but the Japanese had missed their primary targets. 3 American aircraft carriers, the Enterprise, Lexington, and Saratoga, were at sea when the attack came. They survived. And Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the brilliant architect of Pearl Harbor, knew this oversight could prove fatal. In the 6 months following Pearl Harbor, Japan swept across the Pacific like a tidal wave. Hong Kong fell. The Philippines surrendered. Singapore, once deemed an impregnable British fortress, collapsed in what Winston Churchill called the worst disaster in British military history. The oil-rich Dutch East Indies were seized. Japan's empire expanded with breathtaking speed. But Yamamoto was not celebrating. He knew something his colleagues did not fully grasp. America's industrial might was awakening. Every day that passed allowed the United States to build more ships, train more pilots, and mobilize its staggering resources. Japan's window of opportunity was closing fast. Then, on April 18, 1942, something happened that shocked the Japanese military to its core. 16 American B-25 bombers, led by Lieutenant Colonel James Doolittle, appeared over Tokyo. Launched from the carrier USS Hornet in a daring one-way mission, they dropped their bombs on the Japanese capital before flying on toward China. The damage was minimal, but the psychological impact was enormous. The sacred home islands promised to be invulnerable had been violated. The emperor himself was potentially at risk. Yamamoto seized upon the shock and humiliation to push for his. Yamamoto's plan was characteristically ambitious, some would say overly complex. He would use Midway as bait. The tiny atoll, barely 6 miles across at its widest point, was home to an American airbase. It was strategically valuable, sitting at the far edge of the Hawaiian defensive perimeter. More importantly, Yamamoto believed the Americans would have to defend it. And when the U.S. Pacific Fleet, especially those elusive carriers, sailed out to save Midway, the combined fleet would be waiting to destroy them in one decisive engagement. But Yamamoto's plan suffered from a critical flaw: overcomplication. His forces were divided into multiple groups spread across hundreds of miles of ocean. The Kido Butai, his elite carrier strike force commanded by Vice Admiral Kiichi Nagamo, consisted of 4 fleet carriers: Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu. These were the same carriers that had devastated Pearl Harbor. Supporting them, but positioned far to the rear, was Yamamoto's main body, including the massive battleship Yamato, at the time the largest warship ever built. Additionally, a diversionary force would attack the Aleutian Islands in Alaska, drawing American attention northward. The dispersal of forces meant that when battle came, the carriers would be on their own. Yamamoto's battleships, the ships he believed would finish off any crippled American vessels, would be too far away to help when the crisis arrived. But Yamamoto had another problem, one he didn't even know existed. Deep in the basement of the 14th Naval District headquarters at Pearl Harbor, a team of cryptanalysts worked around the clock. Led by Commander Joseph Rochefort, Station Hippo had been painstakingly breaking into the Japanese Navy's operational code, designated JN-25B by the Americans. By early May 1942, they were picking up increasing references to an upcoming operation against a target designated AF. The date seemed to be early June, and the force involved appeared massive, but where was AF? Rochefort suspected it was Midway, but he needed proof, so he devised an elegant trap. He had Midway send an uncoded message reporting that their water purification system had broken down. The base transmitted this information via undersea cable secure from Japanese interception, and then broadcast it over open radio frequencies. Within 24 hours, station HYPO intercepted a Japanese message reporting that AF was short on water. The trap had worked. Yamamoto's entire operation was now an open book. Admiral Chester Nimitz, Commander-in-Chief of the Pacific Fleet, now held an extraordinary advantage. He knew where the Japanese were coming, when they would arrive, and what forces they would bring. But he still faced daunting odds. Yamamoto was bringing 4 fleet carriers. Nimitz could muster 3 Enterprise, Hornet, and if the damaged Yorktown could be repaired in time, perhaps a third. Yorktown had been severely damaged at the Battle of the Coral Sea just 1 month earlier. Naval architects estimated she needed 3 months of repairs at Puget Sound. Nimitz told them they had 3 days. The Pearl Harbor Naval Shipyard worked miracles. For 72 hours straight, work crews labored around the clock. They cut out entire sections of twisted internal frames and replaced them. They patched the flight deck. When Yorktown sailed out on May 30th, welders from the repair ship USS Vestal were still aboard, completing repairs even as the carrier steamed toward its destiny. Nimitz positioned his 3 carriers northeast of Midway at a location codenamed Point Luck. The Japanese expected to achieve complete surprise. Instead, they were sailing into a carefully prepared ambush. At 4:30 a.m. on June 4th, Nagamo launched his opening attack on Midway, 108 aircraft dive bombers, torpedo planes, and 0 fighters. At the same time, he sent out 7 search planes to scan the ocean for American ships. One of those search planes, launched from the heavy cruiser Tone, was delayed by 30 minutes. That seemingly trivial delay would have catastrophic consequences. On Midway, radar picked up the incoming Japanese strike at 5:53 a.m. at a distance of 93 miles. Every available American aircraft scrambled into the sky. The obsolete Brewster Buffalo and Wildcat fighters climbed to intercept, while bombers fled in the opposite direction to attack the Japanese carriers. The Marine fighters met the Japanese armada head-on. It was slaughter. The Zeros, flown by veteran pilots, tore through the American formation. Within minutes, 15 of the 26 defending fighters were shot down. Most of the survivors were damaged. Only 2 remained airworthy. At 6:34 a.m., the Japanese bombers swept over Midway. They struck fuel tanks, destroyed buildings, and cratered runways. But American anti-aircraft fire was fierce and accurate, destroying or damaging numerous Japanese planes. More importantly, the American airbase was bloodied but not knocked out. The leader of the Japanese strike force radioed back a crucial message. A second attack would be necessary. Meanwhile, American bombers from Midway were already hunting for the Japanese carriers. 6 brand-new Grumman Avenger torpedo bombers, 4 B-26 Marauders, and waves of flying fortresses and Marine dive bombers attacked Nagamo's fleet in uncoordinated strikes throughout the morning. It was brave but futile. The Japanese Combat Air Patrol Zero fighters circling protectively above the carriers shot down American planes with ruthless efficiency. Not a single torpedo or bomb struck home. The Japanese seemed invincible. But these attacks had consequences that Nagamo could not yet appreciate. Aboard the flagship Akagi, Admiral Nagamo faced a dilemma. He had kept half his aircraft in reserve, armed with torpedoes in case American warships appeared. But the repeated attacks from Midway, combined with his strike leader's recommendation for a second assault on the island, prompted him to make a fateful choice. At 7:15 a.m., Nagamo ordered his reserve planes to be rearmed with land attack bombs instead of ship-killing torpedoes. On the carrier hangar decks below, crews began the laborious process of switching out weapons. Then, at 7:40 a.m., everything changed. The delayed search plane from Tone finally sent its report. A sizable American naval force had been spotted to the northeast. But the scout pilot failed to specify what types of ships he had found. Nagamo demanded clarification. Another agonizing 20 minutes passed before the scout reported back. The American force included one carrier. Nagamo was now trapped in a tactical nightmare. His hangar decks were cluttered with bombs and torpedoes as crews frantically tried to rearm aircraft. His first strike force from Midway low on fuel and some damaged was circling overhead, desperate to land. Japanese doctrine emphasized launching fully constituted, well-coordinated strikes, not piecemeal attacks. Rear Admiral Tamon Yamaguchi, commanding the carriers Hiryu and Soryu, urged Nagamo to launch immediately with whatever was available. But Nagamo, following doctrine and perhaps still skeptical about the American presence, decided to wait. He would recover his Midway strike force first, then launch a properly armed and coordinated attack. It seemed like a reasonable decision. But while Nagamo delayed, the Americans were already in the air, heading straight for him. Admiral Raymond Spruance, commanding Task Force 16 from the Enterprise, had made a bold decision. Even though the range was extreme over 150 miles, he ordered his carriers to launch immediately. Every minute counted. The Japanese had to be hit before they could launch their own strike. Beginning at 7 a.m., Enterprise and Hornet began launching their aircraft. Fighters, dive bombers, and torpedo planes roared into the sky. The Yorktown followed suit an hour later. But coordination fell apart almost immediately. The different aircraft types flew at different speeds. Some squadrons followed incorrect headings. The strike force that was supposed to hit the Japanese as a unified hammer instead became separated into scattered fragments. Torpedo Squadron 8 from the Hornet, led by Lieutenant Commander John Waldron, broke away from its assigned course. Waldron had a hunch about where the Japanese would be, and he followed his instincts. At 9:20 a.m., his 15 TBD Devastator torpedo bombers spotted the Kido Butai. They were completely alone, no fighter escort. No dive bombers to divide the enemy's attention. Just 15 slow, obsolete torpedo planes against the most powerful carrier force in the world. Waldron didn't hesitate. He led his squadron into the attack. The Zeros fell upon them like wolves on sheep. One by one, the Devastators were blown out of the sky. Flaming aircraft tumbled into the ocean. Some pilots tried to crash land on the water, only to be strafed as they climbed from their sinking planes. Not a single torpedo hit its target. All 15 aircraft were destroyed. Of the 30 men in Torpedo Squadron 8, only one survived, Ensign George Gay, who clung to a floating seat cushion and watched the rest of the battle unfold from the water. Torpedo Squadron 6 from Enterprise attacked next. They lost 10 of their 14 aircraft. Torpedo Squadron 3 from Yorktown followed minutes later. 10 of their 12 planes were shot down. In less than an hour, American torpedo squadrons had been virtually annihilated. The Japanese had suffered no damage whatsoever. The attack seemed to be a complete disaster. But those brave pilots had accomplished something crucial without knowing it. They had pulled the Japanese combat air patrol down to sea level, chasing slow torpedo planes. The Zeros were now out of position, low on ammunition, and low on fuel. And high above, unseen and undetected, the American dive bombers were arriving. Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey led the Enterprise dive bomber squadrons. They had been searching for the Japanese carriers for over an hour, and fuel was running critically low. Some pilots had already turned back, their tanks nearly empty. Then McCluskey spotted something, a lone Japanese destroyer racing northward at full speed, leaving a long white wake across the blue ocean. It was the destroyer Arashi rejoining the carrier fleet after depth-charging the American submarine Nautilus. McCluskey made the most important decision of his life. He followed that wake. At approximately 10:20 a.m., the clouds parted, and there below him lay the entire Kido Butai, all 4 carriers, turning into the wind to launch their strike against the American fleet. Their decks were crowded with aircraft, fully fueled and armed. Fuel hoses snaked across the decks. Bombs and torpedoes sat exposed on the hangar decks, moved from storage in preparation for the attack. At that precise moment, Yorktown's dive bombers arrived from a different direction. Through sheer luck or divine intervention? As some pilots later claimed, 3 squadrons of American dive bombers had converged on the Japanese carriers at the perfect time. From the perfect altitude, while the Japanese defenses were focused elsewhere, McCluskey gave the order, "Attack!" The SBD Dauntless dive bombers rolled into their 70-degree dives. Pushing through 250 miles per hour, then 300, the pilots lined up their targets through their bomb sights. The carriers grew larger in their windscreens, massive steel platforms covered with aircraft. The first bomb struck the Kaga at 10:22 a.m. 3, possibly 4 bombs slammed into her flight deck. One hit directly in front of the bridge, killing the captain and most of the senior officers instantly. Another punched through the deck into the upper hangar, where it exploded among the armed and fueled aircraft. The entire hangar deck became an inferno. Lieutenant Richard Best, pulling out of his dive toward Kaga, realized the carrier was already doomed. He led his 2 wingmen north toward the Akagi, the Japanese flagship. One of Best's bombs struck Akagi's flight deck near the midship elevator. It penetrated to the hangar deck below, where it detonated among the aircraft waiting to launch. The explosion triggered a chain reaction of blasts as bombs and torpedoes cooked off in the flames. Mitsuo Fukita, the airman who had led the attack on Pearl Harbor, was aboard Akagi. He watched in horror as his ship transformed into a blazing pyre. Bodies lay everywhere. Planes exploded, sending shrapnel scything across the deck. The flames were so intense that damage control efforts were futile. Simultaneously, Yorktown's dive bombers hit the Soryu. At least 3 bombs struck home, each one triggering catastrophic explosions on the crowded flight deck and in the hangar below. In the span of 5 minutes from 10:22 to 10:27 a.m., 3 Japanese fleet carriers had been mortally wounded. The Kido Butai, which had terrorized the Pacific for 6 months, was being destroyed. Admiral Nagamo stood on Akagi's bridge, watching his flagship burn around him. His staff finally convinced him to transfer his flag to the light cruiser Nagara. As he departed, the ship's captain remained aboard, trying desperately to save his vessel. But there was no saving Akagi, Kaga, or Soryu. The fire. For Soviet soldiers, the memory of what happened at Stalingrad, the brutality they witnessed, the suffering they endured, the comrades they lost, fueled a desire for revenge that would manifest in the final years of the war as Soviet forces advanced westward toward Berlin. The phrase, "revenge for Stalingrad," became a rallying cry. The brutality of urban combat at Stalingrad also changed military doctrine. The lessons learned about city fighting, combined arms operations in urban terrain, and the challenges of sustaining forces in extended urban combat influenced military thinking for decades to come. Today, Stalingrad has been renamed Volgograd. Though in 2025 the city's airport was renamed Stalingrad International Airport in memory of the battle. The city has been rebuilt, but it has never forgotten. Standing on Mamayev Kurgan, the hill that was captured and lost 8 times during the battle, is the motherland calls an 85-meter-tall statue of a woman raising a sword to the sky. It's the tallest statue in Europe and the second tallest statue of a woman in the world. She stands as an eternal guardian, a reminder of the hundreds of thousands who fought and died on that blood-soaked ground. The battle has been memorialized in countless books, films, and documentaries. It has become a central part of Russian national identity and historical memory. Veterans of the battle, when they were still alive, were treated with the highest respect and honor. But perhaps the most important legacy of Stalingrad is what it teaches us about the absolute horror of war. This wasn't a clean battle fought at a distance with tanks and aircraft. This was human beings killing each other at arm's length, in ruins, in basements, in sewers, in the most brutal and intimate ways imaginable. It reminds us that war, stripped of all propaganda and glory, is simply organized mass murder on an industrial scale. The soldiers who fought there, German and Soviet alike, were not abstract statistics. They were human beings, sons, brothers, fathers, husbands. They suffered fear, pain, cold, hunger, and ultimately death in a frozen wasteland of their leaders' making. The civilians trapped in the city were guilty of nothing except being born in the wrong place at the wrong time. Their suffering was immense, largely forgotten, and utterly tragic. The Battle of Stalingrad lasted from July 17, 1942, to February 2, 1943. In that time, over 1.6 million human beings became casualties. An entire city was destroyed so completely that only 1,500 civilians remained from a pre-war population of hundreds of thousands. It was the bloodiest battle in human history. It was the turning point of the Second World War. It was proof that even the seemingly unstoppable Wehrmacht could be defeated. It was hell on earth, a glimpse into the absolute depths of human cruelty and suffering that war can produce, and it must never be forgotten. The ruins of Stalingrad teach us that war is not glorious, it is not noble, it is not an adventure. It is death, destruction, suffering, and waste on an almost incomprehensible scale. Those who survived Stalingrad carried its scars, physical and psychological, for the rest of their lives. The city itself bears those scars still, despite decades of rebuilding. The ground where the battles raged literally cannot forget even now. Human remains, unexploded ordnance, and relics of the battle are regularly uncovered during construction projects. Stalingrad stands as a monument to human endurance, to the terrible cost of totalitarian ambition, and to the absolute necessity of preventing such horrors from ever happening again. Remember Stalingrad, remember the cost, remember the dead, and pray that humanity never sees its like again.